Welcome to week 2 or module 2 of Ethnic Studies 35 Intro to Black and African American Studies. This week covers June 19th through June 25th. We start off this week with a wonderful slide full of the most amazing faces that you can see on earth. The babies. I love children. I used to be a preschool teacher, so I love working with the little ones. But look at these amazing and beautiful little faces. And you know there's some characters too, right? You can just tell. Look at those little smiles. But I asked the question, which child is the most deserving of a happy, healthy, and prosperous life? Let that marinate for a minute. Which one of these kids is most deserving? I would hope that in your mind you're saying that's a ridiculous question. How on earth would we ever be able to say, oh, this child over another is more deserving of a positive life and a positive future? And to me, that's a main concern and area of interest for the field of ethnic studies, which is that we all deserve to be successful and happy and healthy and prosperous. There is no human life that is more valuable than another. Every single one of these babies deserves an equitable chance at having a positive future. So I hope that we carry that sentiment in our hearts as we explore different histories of people that we share our world with. That the goal is to create a world where all of these beautiful little children have the same chances for a happy, healthy, and prosperous life. So we'll start off with a recap from week 1. When we explored the circumstances that led to the birth of the ethnic studies movement, the birth of the courses that you're able to enroll in right now at Delta College. And we also began an introduction into the complex layers of identity. You completed an identity survey that explored your perceptions of yourself and others. And I would love to discuss a little bit deeper about that identity survey because I saw many interesting responses. So I just want to explain a few things as we move forward. The identity survey. Wow, a lot of you had some very interesting responses in the survey itself as to how you felt while you were taking it. What it was like to explore these questions. Many of you responded that you had never really considered these things before, and some of you were a little uncomfortable. Some of you were indifferent. It didn't really impact you one way or the other, and some of you felt enlightened after you took the identity survey. I want to explain that this survey is a part of an activity that is promoted and developed through the University of Michigan. So I did not create this survey. This is an activity that I've done over and over again with different students and different trainings as we explore identity in a way that helps us relate to each other, understand each other better in society. It also points to, some of our, as some of you mentioned, superficial ideas of, how we perceive each other. But nevertheless, I wanted to make sure you understand this is not something that I just created. This is an activity that is used extensively in trainings and in colleges throughout the nation. And it came from this website. Again, this is University of Michigan. And as you can see from the handout on the right hand side, this is actually originally designed to take place in person with people in a classroom, and you get this handout where you mark your responses in that little identity survey. I adapted it for our online class to the online survey format. And then obviously we had a discussion about it. So it's not exactly the same as if we would be in person, but nevertheless, I did want you to understand the origination of this survey. I saw some responses that, made it seem like, oh, I feel like this survey is driving the questions in one direction or the other, and there is no, malintent, or there is no desire in this survey or in this activity to get you to answer in a predisposed way. As you can see, there's many levels of identity. Obviously, these don't represent every single facet of identity that a person has, but it is a good basis for the main components of how we look at each other in society. I also want to say one more thing, that I truly believe that we should rise above our human tendency to look at each other through the lens of race or socioeconomics or gender or religion. But we're not there yet. That's an ideal notion. And hopefully, maybe one day humankind can get there. But as of right now, that's not possible until we really confront some of the issues of the navigation of our identity and how it impacts us in America and beyond America, in the world as a whole. So, again, I just want you to understand the origins of this survey. And now let's take a look at some of your class's results. So, this is a very brief snapshot of just three of the data points from your total identity survey. I want to let you know there is a new module in Canvas that you can find the total report from your identity survey for your class. There's also a link for you to discuss it with others. If you have a reaction, if you wanted to make a comment, you can do so. I want to engage, or give you the opportunity to engage you in communication with each other. But this is not an assignment for credit. In your identity survey module, with the survey results and the discussion post, that's solely optional. You won't be penalized if you don't check it out, but I do want you to check it out if it's something that you're interested in. Some of you say you wanted to see what the results would be after everybody was done completing the survey. So what I have here is just three little screenshots of that survey, just to give you a little taste of what it looks like. So you can see at the top the question, which race or ethnicity do you most identify with? You can tell that we have a very diverse class. And you can pay more specific attention to the different details when you interact with the survey yourself. I'm kind of moving fast through this. But then when you look to the right, it says, which facet of your personal identity do you identify with or think about the most? And again, you can see the how we're thinking, or the class, your fellow classmates have a very diverse way of identifying yourself. Now, I understand that some of you said, oh, there's elements of my identity that I don't see on this list. And that's understood. I mean, there's probably thousands of ways that people could look at themselves. But, for the purpose of this survey, they kind of summarized it into general categories. And what I want to point out again is that, we look at ourselves in very, very various ways. We identify with ourselves in such a complex layer. Some of you wrote that I would put more than one. It was hard to choose just one, and I completely understand that. But as we move on, one of the main points that I wanted to make, particularly in reference to the content of this course, is that third chart at the bottom, which asks, in your opinion, which facet of identity has the strongest impact on how Americans in general perceive each other? And across the board in all of my ethnic studies courses, this question generated the highest percentage of majority answers. So you can see that the majority, vast majority, of students in your class believe that race or ethnicity is the strongest facet of identity that impacts how Americans perceive each other. Even though many of you noted that's not the way it should be, why do we look at each other on these surface levels? And I agree that, at a certain point in the timeline of humanity, I really hope that there will come a time when we don't see somebody for the color of their skin, or perceive them because of the clothes that they have on as being less than or different. But we're not there yet. And that's the main point that I want to make. And it seems reflected by the responses of your fellow classmates that we still live in a very racialized society. And we will explore the origins of how did we even get here? Where did this even start? That's what we're going to be focusing on this week. What's the big picture of week 2? Well, we are going to begin with an exploration of the glory and power of ancient African civilizations. Many of us may recall being taught very briefly of Africa prior to slavery in our K 12 experience, or maybe we've taken a course on African history in college, or maybe we come from Africa so we have firsthand knowledge. But the truth of the matter is that the history of the power of this massive continent has been marginalized to the point where we know very little, or the average person knows very little of African history. And we are not a history class, so we can't delve too deep into it, but we must begin with a brief introduction to African civilization, African invention, African power, knowledge, wisdoms, inventions before the interruption of slavery. Because certainly the trajectory of Africa and African people would have changed the world as we know it today if slavery never existed. I'm including this snapshot just to give you an idea of how massive the continent of Africa is. And it is a continent, not a country. So there are 53, 54 countries within Africa. Okay. And you can see, for perspective's sake, that Africa can fit the entire continental United States, the entire country of China, of India, of Japan, all of Europe, right? With room to spare. That's how big this landmass is and how widespread you can imagine the various peoples, languages, customs, cultures, tribes exist within. So, just to give us a little perspective, I love to share this image to let you know of the vast power and landmass of this amazing continent. In part 2 of week 2, we're going to ask ourselves these questions. Have you ever wondered about the beginnings of racism in our world? Some of us think that it may have started with slavery or with the genocide that took place against Native Americans on this continent. But, have you ever gone to the source and really tried to pinpoint, where did this begin? Was it always a part of human existence to have hatred towards those who look or appear or act, speak differently than each other? So, where did it begin, and how, and who was responsible for the development of these views? So, we're going to identify the origins of racism and how it created a social, religious, political, educational perspectives and systems that have negatively impacted us as human beings for more than 600 years. And in the next few slides, we will get right to the point. Check out this quite ominous image of a gathering, a meeting, if you will. This took place in Spain somewhere in the 15th century. The limpieza de sangre, or the purity of blood doctrine, was created at meetings such as this. What was the limpieza de sangre? It was a doctrine that was created by Spain, the first nation to begin colonization in the quote unquote New World. At that time, in order to hold a position of power, in order to live or be a citizen or travel in the Spanish Empire, you needed a probanza, or a certification de limpieza de sangre, right? Limpieza, to clean, like clean blood, pure European Christian blood. When you see this picture, you see the characters who are wearing those tall, white, pointy hats. What does that remind you of? I know personally, I would say, ooh, that looks kind of like KKK, right? Which is another quote unquote organization that was founded on the basis of white purity, right? And we will make connections in upcoming weeks. But this is the very beginning of indoctrinated racism on earth. And we're going to watch a short video that further explains the details of the limpieza de sangre. Because I was unable to embed the short excerpt Limpieza de Sangre from the series Enslaved into this recording, I ask that you go to Canvas modules to watch the very short video. It is critically important that you view Limpieza de Sangre this week. What you see here is a picture that depicts the way that Spain interpreted the way that different people mixed with Spanish people. So you'll see Español con moro. So black and Spanish equals a mulatto, or what makes you a mestiza or a chino. So it's very fascinating and also very concerning. But this is the direct linkage to the origins of racism as we know it on the earth today. So please watch the video Limpieza de Sangre. It enforced that individuals must be able to trace their lineage back 4 generations. That means 4 sets of grandparents had to have been white Europeans in order for you to be a resident or to have power or to travel within the Spanish Empire. This is what we are talking about when we say the beginnings of racism. So that was an excerpt from the series Enslaved, which is a super powerful series that I really recommend for you to check out. I think it's on Amazon Prime Video. But let's talk about this. The purity of blood for all 4 lines meant that, and of course, this was written in about 1722. All 4 of your grandparents had to have been Christian in order for you to be considered a pure human being underneath the Spanish doctrine. This excluded Jewish people, this excluded Muslim people from being able to obtain positions of power and to reside in the Spanish Empire. And it justified the acts of colonization, genocide, slavery, torture, murder, rape, etc. If your bloodline for 4 grandparents were not purely European, therefore you were considered a pagan, therefore anything negative that they wished to do to you was justified because you were not considered a pure human being. And it didn't even matter if they converted you to Christianity at that point, because even though you were a convert, your 4 grandparent lines were not Christian, so you would never be considered equal. And this is the true origin of racist ideology. Please read along with me for the next couple of slides because there is so much critical information. I'm going to need to share it with you word for word. The European origins of racism. Beginning in the late 14th century, a very close relationship was forged between the racial ideologies of raza in Spain and casta in Portugal. Raza was a racial ideology that differentiated between people based on the heresy in their lineage. It held that the heresy of Jews and Muslims was inherited by blood in humans, just as various characteristics were inherited by blood in animals. And heresy means opposing doctrine to Christianity, opposing beliefs or different beliefs other than a different religion. The Portuguese sistema de casta was a racial ideology that differentiated between people based on skin pigmentation inherited through blood. Casta developed in opposition to the indigenous peoples in the quote unquote New World, who populated the soon to be discovered colonies of Spain and Portugal. So we have to understand these two concepts of raza and casta: blood lineage and skin pigmentation, which, when combined, really were the foundations of racist ideology in Spain and Portugal. By 1702, casta became entirely associated with color. By the time this discussion took place in 1702, few institutions, religious or otherwise, questioned the association of black blood with impurity, and black skin color had become a marker of impure ancestry. In the course of the 17th century, the concept had gone from being mainly associated with having old Christian ancestry to being connected to whiteness. This link would become even stronger in the 18th century, with the introduction of the Spanish into the quote unquote New World. It is estimated that up to 95% of the original indigenous population was destroyed. There is no question that the Spaniards destroyed large numbers of people through violence, but many have said that the largest percentage of the indigenous population was destroyed by diseases carried over by the Europeans, such as typhus, smallpox, measles, etc., that they had never encountered and to which they had no resistance. In any case, it is clear, as there was no census, it can never be established exactly how many people died, nor whether it was due to Christianizing genocide or disease. As the indigenous population had been reduced so drastically, 80 to 95% reduced, Spain imported the African or black slaves initially under the control of Portugal to introduce a new labor supply and to withstand disease as well as be profitable business. Initially, black slaves were introduced by Hernan Cortez to work on the very first sugar plantations after the populations of indigenous Indians had been reduced so drastically due to disease, murder, and torture and genocide. So, this is showing us the very ways that racism transferred initially from religion and blood lineage to skin color, and the ways that the Spaniards and the Portuguese decimated indigenous populations when they traveled to the New World and needed desperately, in order to achieve their goals, a labor supply, which could no longer be filled by the indigenous native people of the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, they needed another labor supply, and Africans were the next in line. So I know that some of us question, why would Spain and Portugal resort to such cruelty, what some may consider evil tactics, in order to gain progress and success for their countries? And in order to ponder that question, we have to consider the factors that led Europe to commit these centuries of colonization, genocide, racism, and white supremacy. Let's explore the conditions of Europe in the 1400s and 1500s on the eve of the emergence of the slave trade, of the processes of centuries of colonization. So, these pictures paint a pretty dreary image of what life was like in Europe. There were widespread um, examples of famine, starvation, a lack of food, a lack of resources, uh, bad weather, which prohibited the growth of healthy crops, of fruits and vegetables, or limited ability to grow healthy food and vegetables, which would maintain nutrition for healthy people. So starvation impacted Europe. Infant and childhood death, the rates of infant and childhood death were rampant because children were unnourished, exposed to diseases, living in filthy conditions. So population was not able to flourish and grow. Violence and brutality was apparent. And as you can see in some of these images, the lifestyles, you see beheadings, you see people fighting each other and wars. Um, you can see up at the top the image of people fighting over a dog, probably to eat because of lack of food. So violence and brutality plagued European countries. Disease, obviously, which rampaged communities. And you can see in one of the pictures a scary looking person on a deathbed looking like he or she's being visited by like the angel of death. Very scary. Up at the top, the procession of the skeletons with scepters, very dark and depressing and scary. Overcrowding conditions. There is a very limited amount of land in Europe for people to spread out. So when people are forced to live in close confines with disease and starvation added into the picture, it led to a very bad outcome. Poor weather, as I had mentioned, cold, dark, dampness with little sunshine, um, early death or people dying too early of diseases, and lack of resources for people to grow and flourish. So, this is just but a very quick snapshot of the conditions that human beings in Europe were living through in this time frame, which led to the deep desire to expand outside of Europe. And you can imagine when these individuals traveled outside and saw the beauty, the lushness, the richness of the land of the Caribbean, of the Americas, of Africa, and all of the resources that these lands had. You can almost imagine why they were so tempted and became so obsessed with leaving their diseased and cold and forbidden homelands for other places. Let's also look at the natural resources on the European map. So, what do we see predominantly here? We see coal, copper, fish, iron ore, lead, petroleum, silver, timber, uranium, zinc. What do these things have in common though? They're mostly metals, right? Precious metals. We don't see gold, maybe a little bit of silver, yeah, maybe copper, but not gold, and definitely coal. And if we're looking at Spain and Portugal, we see coal predominantly, maybe lead, and throughout Europe as well, uh, metals. And that played a critical role in the development of their warfare and their ability to go into uncharted territories and destroy civilizations. And we will make the link between the natural resources of Europe versus the natural resources of the lands of the Americas and Africa in a moment. Now let's look at a map of Africa as a contrast to the map of Europe's natural resources. And what do we see? What do we notice is different? I think one of the main things that we can identify is how rich African land is with precious resources such as gold and diamonds and oil and gas. Um, in comparison with Europe, who traditionally had mostly hard metals, right? So we see in Africa the presence of oil, gas, coal, copper, bauxite, gold, diamonds, timber, uranium, chromium. And when we look at the West African territories from which most of the African ancestors descended from, we see that those lands of Ghana, Cameroon, Gabon, Sierra Leone had diamonds, had gold, had timber, had bauxite and copper as well. Africa is a rich continent with resources beyond just these precious metals, but also the fertility of the land, to be able to support the growth of fruits and vegetables and resources that human beings need in order to be healthy, in order to live. So it's really critical that we identify at the very beginnings of colonization and of the slave trade what these lands had that made them so appealing for Europeans, particularly Spain and Portugal at the onset, to pillage, to rob, and to covet for themselves, for the wealth of their own nations. When we move to an exploration of the natural resources of the lands of the Americas and the Caribbean, we see a similar resource as in Africa, meaning the richness of the land in gold, and copper and different resources such as natural gas, petroleum, silver, lead, aluminum, coal, etc. These lands, similar to Africa, were also overwhelmingly rich with resources in contrast to Europe's resources, which again leads us to better understand why Spain and Portugal were so desperate to plunder these territories, and expand their empires into these more desirable lands for their people. Here's a snapshot of the populations of the Americas prior to European colonization and exploration. I certainly don't have time to name each various tribe, but what's important to note is that every bit of land of the United States, of Canada, of Mexico, of Central America was occupied, was civilized by a native or indigenous people that were vastly decimated at the arrival of the Spanish and of the Portuguese. And to this day, although we don't know often the names of the lands that we live on, the indigenous names of the lands and the people that occupied the land that we live on, we must acknowledge that this land was robbed and stolen from them, and that their people were killed, murdered, by various means in the name of colonization. So we always give respect to the indigenous peoples and lands that we occupy today. Another image of the United States in 1492 and the beauty of the people whose land this is. And this slide portrays the reality of the genocide committed against Native American peoples from 1784 to 1972. If we look at the top left corner, we'll see 1784 to 1819, how densely populated America was by Native American tribes. And as you can see, as the years go by, little by little by little by little, until we come to our present day Indian reservations, you can see how the people and their lands have been taken over and how they have been reduced incredibly, in size and in number, to a few present day Indian reservations. And this is a harrowing reality of the sheer numbers of Native people who were either killed or who were forced off of their land by colonization to get to where we are today, where we see so few Native American reservations and people in our societies. And this is absolute genocide, and this is absolute evil. Europe's most dangerous technology, armor and swords. Please read along with me. The conquest of the Americas proves decisively the advantage of advanced armor and weaponry in any conflict. The Aztecs and the Incas numbered in the millions, yet were defeated by Spanish forces numbering in the hundreds. How was that possible? Many of us have seen the images of the battles between the Aztecs and the Spaniards and wondered, why is there such a disadvantage when we see Aztecs fighting in their bare skin with maybe spears or other weapons that they had fashioned versus Europeans heavily coated in armor from head to toe. Let's keep reading. Like the cavalry, Spanish foot soldiers made good use of swords. A heavily armored Spanish foot soldier could cut down dozens of indigenous people in minutes with a fine Toledan blade. A heavily armored conquistador could slay dozens of foes in a single engagement without receiving one serious wound. Encased from head to toe in a steel shell, Spanish conquistadors were all but invulnerable when facing native opponents. Horses were another advantage that the natives could not counter. So if you've ever asked yourself, how is it that Spain and Portugal were able to come into civilizations with millions of people who were trained in war, who were warriors, who could fight? How is it that they were able to conquer and colonize these people? It's very simple. They had the advantage of armor and swords. And how did they have those things? Because their resources in their countries provided for them to be able to create those armors that would allow them to slay, as this slide depicts, dozens of people in minutes. And maybe this might help us create a more clear understanding of the disadvantage that native and indigenous people had when fighting the Spaniards and the Portuguese. And it was no lack of strength or no lack of intelligence on behalf of native people. It was just simply that they did not have the armor in battle and they didn't have the horses, which provided the Europeans with a great advantage in their colonization and in their genocide. Another example of an advantage that Europeans had over Africans and peoples of the Americas is guns and gunpowder. Like modern computer manufacturers, the gunsmiths of late medieval and early modern Europe were growing more effective at making weapons. And as in modern industries where productivity growth was particularly rapid when new weapons were first introduced. When the first handguns appeared on the scene circa 1400, and at that point they were very tiny little handheld cannons that were fired from on top of the city's walls. The metal founders who cast them reduced the prices drastically. Gunpowder reached Europe from China shortly before 1300, and firearms appeared during the 14th century. And the earliest surviving firearm in Europe had been found in Estonia, and it dates back to around 1396. But by 1380, handguns were known across Europe. This picture does a pretty good job of summing up what the processes of colonization and the robbing, pillaging, and plundering of Africa and the Americas looks like. As you can see, we now have an image of the continent of Africa that is just kind of dug out while all of its riches are now sitting on top of the lands of Europe. And when we look on the opposite side and see South America, Mexico, Central America, etc., we see how those lands have been robbed with the gold and all of the profits and wealth now sitting in the North Americas as well. Read along with me, please. By 1600, Spain had reaped substantial monetary benefits from New World resources. Gold and silver began to connect European nations through trade, and the Spanish money supply ballooned, which signified the beginning of the economic system known as capitalism. The new riches ultimately created mass inflation and economic distress. However, Spain gained creative capital from their new global reach. These developments catapulted Spain into the Golden Age, or Siglo de Oro. Riches poured in from the colonies, and new ideas poured in from other countries and new lands. The Habsburg dynasty, who ruled over the territories of Austria, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, and Spain, encouraged and financed a blossoming Spanish Renaissance culture, both in the colonies and in Spain. So, as the peoples of the territories that were colonized suffered, the benefactors of colonization flourished. And we can see those examples of wealth still present in Europe and in North America today. And now we can see how what is now considered the third world has been left as a result of such systems and such policies of capitalism. Here we can see a few disturbing political images or propaganda that was used during the European colonization efforts of Africa, particularly the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, in which you see a group of European men, potentially French, um, with a cake, if you will, that says Afrique or Africa, and that they can just slice up, and everybody takes a slice as if Africa is just theirs for the taking. And on the right hand side, you see a picture of a man with his grubby fingers kind of grabbing all over Africa for its gold. So you can understand the notion that these lands were just ripe for the taking, and it didn't matter that they, were ancient lands with ancient civilizations that belonged to people. Africa was now seen as land and people ripe for the taking. This image always troubles me when I see it, but the image of a European man standing with his feet and arms outstretched across the entire continent of Africa as if it is his, as if he owns it, right? When we look at the map, we can see African colonization after the Berlin Conference, which we will read about more in depth. But basically, this is how the countries were divvied up among different European countries. So you can see the heavy prominence of French colonialism throughout West Africa into Central Africa, British in red, uh, uh, Portuguese in yellow, German in orange, Italian in blue, Spanish also, right? So Africa was a cake or a pie to them that they could conquer and take over. And to this day, these nations were colonized, with the exception of two African countries, which were able to avoid colonization or gain their liberation, which are identified by the only two nations in Africa which are labeled as free. One being Liberia on the west coast of Africa, and the other being Ethiopia on the east coast, who was able to fight off the Italian invasion and protect Ethiopian land from colonization. But every other nation, as you can see, was colonized and divided up by European nations. So this concludes your week 2 presentation. Please refer to Canvas for your additional readings, videos, and for your homework assignments this week. I hope that this information has intrigued you and inspired you to learn more, and I look forward to reading about your perspectives and reactions to this powerful and critical information. Take care, everyone.